Welcome back to the Watchman. We're going to be starting a mini-series on two books of the Bible named after the women, Ruth and Esther. There's so many people that we could cover, like Adam and Eve, Noah, Moses, Abraham, Joseph, David, Jonah, and many, many more. But the books of Ruth and Esther stand out as two powerful testimonies of God's providence, faithfulness, and redemption in the lives of his people. While Ruth tells the story of a foreign woman's unwavering loyalty and how God weaves into her into the lineage of Jesus Christ, Esther reveals how one woman's courage and obedience saves an entire nation. Together, these two books highlight God's sovereign hand at work, even in the most unlikely circumstances, demonstrating that he uses ordinary people for extraordinary purposes. Now, to begin, the story of Ruth is one of the most deeply touching narratives in all of the scriptures. It begins near the end of the era of Judges, about a century before the time of David. We have three main people in this story: Boaz, Naomi, and Ruth. It's kind of a flawless love story that runs full with roller coaster of emotions, gut-wrenching grief, and glad-hearted triumph. Ruth's life was a true historical experience of one genuinely extraordinary woman. A story of loss, love, and legacy. The book of Ruth begins with a short but powerful statement. This opening phrase immediately situates the events of Ruth within the historical period of the Judges, a time of great instability and moral decline in Israel's history. Understanding this backdrop will help us see the contrast between the darkness of that era and the bright story of faithfulness, redemption, and God's providence found in the book of Ruth. So when we read Ruth, chapter 1, verse 1a, it says, "Now it came about in the days when the judges governed." The phrase "in the days when the judges governed" puts this typically between the year 1380 and 1050 BC, the time covered in the book of Judges. This period was marked by Israel repeatedly falling into sin, being oppressed by enemies, crying out to God, and then being delivered by a judge. This cycle shows the people's inconsistency to following God and their frequent descent into idolatry. Key phrases throughout Judges include, "In those days there was no king in Israel. Every man did that which was right in his own eyes." It was a time of anarchy, confusion, and unfaithfulness to the law of God. Everything that Israelites should shun. It calls to mind a period of Israel's apostasy, moral degradation, and oppression. Eventually, even King Solomon constructed a place of worship for Chemosh in 1 Kings 11:7, which King Josiah later destroyed in 2 Kings 23, verses 1 through 25. Now, chronology is very important. Without chronology, it is not impossible to understand history, but chronology is the backbone of history. Chronology pertains to the relationship of biblical events to actual dates within the framework of time. It is also helpful to have a general picture of Bible chronology in order to put history in developmental perspective. It gives the biblical scholar a sense of historical flow. Here are some focal points of chronology that surround the book of Ruth. Judges was written with the purpose of explaining how the 10 tribes were then extinct. The two stories in Judges 17 through 21 show a fallen people seemingly beyond the hope of redemption. While the stories of Othniel and Ehud are described in a few short verses in Judges chapter 3, verse 9 and 3:15, other critical events at this same time are described in two different stories found at the end of the book. Judges 17 opens up with almost a parody of idolatry. A man named Micah has lots of money. His mother uses the money to make an idol, and Micah hires a freelancing Levite as his personal priest. This Jonathan, born in the land in the very early days of the settlement, occupied a minor office as a Ephraimite who himself, infected with the prevalent idolatry of Canaan, had made himself idols, graven images, and set them up in his home, which can be found in Judges 17. Now, Jonathan accepted and entered his duties as apostate priest to an idolater. The depths of ignorance into which Israelites like Micah had fallen is well illustrated by his comment upon the situation in Judges 17:13. In other words, by getting a religious authority to bless his idolatrous enterprise, Micah believes he co-opted God into churning out the goods he craves. Human greed and arrogance is on display as he believes in these so-called manufactured little gods. So it was Jonathan, who is the grandson of Moses, who became the first high priest of the first organized system of idolatry to be established in Israel. As a result, Micah's idols and Jonathan were taken captive in these late chapters of Judges. It's during this time that God was punishing Israel for their spiritual famine, which we'll see referenced in Ruth. And with this great famine found in Ruth 1:1b, around 1294 BC, God was orchestrating something fantastically wonderful behind the scenes. In 1290 BC, the Sodomite men of Gibeah rape and kill a Bethlehem concubine. Her master sends 12 body parts to the 12 tribes who gather for war. That can be found in Judges 19:21, or through chapters 19 to 21. The destruction of the tribe of Benjamin follows. In 1284 to 1203, Ehud, one of the surviving 600 men of Benjamin, defeats Eglon, who is also into idolatry and little god worship. In 1284, we enter Ruth chapter 1, verse 6, when it says the famine is over, Israel repenting. So here, this is kind of where we have the chronology of events in Judges and in Ruth coexisting at the same time. And it just gives you a little bit more of an idea of when the book of Ruth is occurring. Now, on one hand, we have Moses' grandson, Jonathan, setting up idolatry. But I did not say on the other side, we have Aaron's grandson taking down idolatry, which is Phinehas. And so there's this contrast, this cycle of constantly the Israelites just repeating the idolatry worship and then repenting through God's judgment and oppression and everything from their enemies. And then, of course, they have a couple period of blessing, and then all of a sudden they're back to the top where they're worshiping little gods again. And the cycle just continues. So the opening words of Ruth here set the stage for a powerful contrast. While the time of Judges was marked by sin and suffering, Ruth's story is going to reveal that even in the darkest times, God remains faithful to those who seek him. The famine and struggles of Naomi's family are not just historical details. They set up a divine story of ruin, redemption, resolve, and reward. That ultimately leads to the lineage of King David and eventually Jesus Christ. Now, throughout the Old Testament, the relations between Israel and Moab ranged with uneasy tension, as we will see as we continue to dive in. And then the story of Ruth will unfold. But I hope you gained some insight into this quick, brief overview of the chronology between the book of Ruth and the book of Judges, and just how wicked the Israelites were and how they let other nations influence them. And then even specific people in that time period even set up the idolatry worship. And this whole concept that we read in the beginning, Ruth 1b, saying, now it came about in the days when the judges governed. That's it for now. The next couple Watchman videos will cover chapters 1, 2, 3, and 4 of Ruth. We'll have a review. So until then, take care, God bless, and be strong.